is we're going to study test input field in HTML. So we're going to look at radio buttons, we're going to look at the selector, we're going to look at a bigger input field and a button as well with an input field and import of files. So let's get started. The previous one we learned about list, and then let me clear that from here. Okay, so in input field, normally we can have a form tag, a label, and then an input field, but we don't necessarily need that if we only need input field. So for example, we can only use the input tag, which is this, and we save this. So simply we have an input field, which is very easy to do, right? But mostly we need to add additional things to it. For example, we need to add the type, which type of input field, because we'll be having so many types for input field. So let's say this one will have a type of test. So let's have a test input field, and then we're gonna have a name, and that name will show before the input field. So let's say we're doing a username input field, and then we can add an ID to it. So this ID is very important because we can have a label which will link to this ID later on, or we can even use a CSS to even style it. So we having an ID have good benefits. So you can decide not to have an ID if you don't want to do any labeling for it, or probably you don't want to hook up to any CSS with it. So let's say username. Let's save it and see what we have on the screen. We still have the same thing, right? So what we're gonna do here is to add a label to it. So you see here, when we click, we can see the username. This is still only showing because of the browser. I mean, the browser can actually figure out what is inside this. So let's look at adding a label to it. To add a label to it, we need to actually group this in a form tag. So we need to first add a form tag here and open it wide. Inside we should have the input field inside the form, and then we should have our label. So let me quickly add a label tag on top, so that we have username in front of our input field. So with the label, we're gonna have username here. So username, and then we have it there. Great. Let's see what we got here. So we have username in front of the input field. Okay, so normally you can add what we call the for means the label can represent the input field, and then that is when we can also utilize the ID which we already have there. So for, and then this username here, because we can decide to hide this input field and the label will still be displaying, and when we click on it, it still makes use of that. So this is a really good standard of naming your input field, having the name in there, and then having the ID. That ID could be hooked up to a CSS or probably a for label when we hide this input field. Okay, so next let's look at more of a checkbox and radio buttons. So that is very simple, but what we have to do is we're gonna create a little bit of a good looking checkbox. So let's get started. So let's have our form still there, and we can either have an action or something that is when you are adding a little bit of a little bit of JavaScript and all that to it, I need this method, but not needed here, but just adding it so you know what you can do with these forms. And so action, you can have post and action, not really relevant here, but just the standard of doing it when you want to add JavaScript for it to actually perform an action or event. So let's have our field set. Field set is gonna group our button into into groups, but we can decide not to do that. For example, let me say I want to just ignore this and then add let me say I want to add a simple input with a checkbox. So what I can do is to use the input, and inside the input, instead of using the name as text, that's the type that I showed you first, the type, we can simply put a checkbox as a type in there. And let's see what we have on the screen. We have this as a checkbox. Very easy to do, right? So but we want to add values to it, so you can easily have some labels attached to it and IDs attached to it. So I want to decorate this a little bit, so we're gonna have the standard way of doing it. If we want to include some action or event in the future, we use the method and the action at the top. So let me put this in here. Okay, so we can have a legend, and a legend simply means a label for this input. So there's nothing scary about this. It's just a label for the input field. So the legend, let's call this probably hobbies, and for the hobby we can have maybe 3 check boxes here. So for this one, let's say we want to have 2 labels for it. We'll have sport, music, and reading. So what we can have here is to add the name of it to that, and then we can add a value to it. So we can have several of this but have different value attached to it. So we said this input box, the name, that is a standard way of doing it, will be hobby, and then the checkbox value. The checkbox value will be sports. Let's say sport for the value. Okay, let me save this. Let's see what we got on the screen. So we have the hobbies inside our legend showing, and then we have a value, and then an ID of sports. Okay, so these are all the parameters we can use in input field. So we have the checkbox, which is automatically cool. We have the name, which identify or have a unique naming for each of the input field you have. We have this value, which this value can be passed in actions later on with the ID, and we can see this value on the screen. So now that I have this, I will have another label, but let me have this one here beneath it. Okay, but this is gonna be music. ID here will be music, and then the value will be music. So I'm gonna have different checkboxes. So let me add a label to this one. And label, okay. So for the label, it's gonna be for the spot, and then we'll have another label for the music. So let me do this for the sports. So it's gonna show sports. Okay, but we need to make sure this label is for sports. So that is why we have the ID at the top here. So I'm gonna use that ID here. So now it's just linked to that. Okay, let's see what we got. So we got spot. So we can duplicate this label for music as well. So just the ID. Then it's, oh no, so let me have music here. So okay, so we got all set for that one. Okay, so we have the legend, which is actually at the top of it, when we have one checkbox and two checkboxes. So this is using the label to actually show this, and then we have the checkbox inside the input. But I want a border around it, so it should be at the side of the hobbies and around what we have here. We need to put all this in a field set. So on top of the legend, we need to add another tag called field set, and the field set is gonna wrap around our input. So right after the label. Great, so this is what we were looking for, this field set, group this checkbox into one, which is really good. So we can have another one by just duplicating this. For example, we can copy this and then paste it right beneath. So now we have checkbox. We can change this to a radio button, the type, instead of the checkbox. So let's do radio. So we have a radio here, and then we have a radio here. Now this normally we use it for selections like gender. So it needs to be a proper selection when you are using either checkbox or radio button. So let's say this is gender and the other one is hobby, so this one is gender. And then the value, we need to have a good value for it. So we say this is male and this is female. And this should be male for the ID, and this is female for the ID. But what you have to know is, if you are not using the ID, you can ignore it. Right? I mean, I'm showing you every parameter which can be in the input and can be used in the near future. Okay, so let's go, and then we have gender and then sport. So we have a really cool setup for our field set and legend, and now we know how to do checkboxes and radio buttons. Next, let's see if we can add a select box. So for select box, we'll still have to be in our field set so that we could have something good around it. So the field set like I said, we are not performing any action, so you can ignore this. Oh, open field set. Okay, so inside a field set, let's have, if we want to have these lines around it, then we can keep the field set. If not, we can leave it. But here we need to have what we call the select tag, since we want to do a selection. So we do the select tag, and inside the select tag we need to have an option of what we are selecting. So it's called the option tag. This is option, yes. Okay, so we need to have more than one option, so we need to actually duplicate this. So let's say we want 2 options, and for every option we need to have a value for it. So for this one, let me add let's say red car, and I need to have a value for this, and the value should be the same, red car or any other one. Then we're gonna have these option. Let's say it's a blue car, so let's say we got blue car here. Good, but we need to make sure one of these options are always selected inside our drop down. So we need to use what we call the selected. So let's say we want this blue should be the default selection inside our drop down. We need to simply do let's say blue. Let me set the value first. Value, and set it to blue car. And with the blue car, we need to add a default select. So select equal to selected. Selected. So this means we'll have one as a default, and then we can change in between it whenever we want. So blue car is already in there because we have the selected added to the blue car. If we add the selected to the red car, then it's gonna be a default one. So let's try that. I cut this and then paste it in here. When I reload, it's gonna have a default of a red car. Then we can select the blue car. But like I said, the field set is only giving it a nice border, but if we take that off, we're still gonna have a drop down with no borders. Okay, so this is really cool when we want to do a selection inside our input field. So now we can have a title for every grouping in our selection if we want. But if we want to do that, we need to add what we call a label using an option group. So for this one, if we want to have an option group for this, I can add a tag here and call the option group. So we're grouping this selection. It's just like, adding a label. Make sure you have the closing tag right below this. Okay, so in the option group, we need to have what we call the value, which is going to be the name of that selection group. So let's give a label, and the label should be cars. Okay, now let's say we want to have two groups in there. If we want to have two groups there, we need to copy this and then paste it. That's another group. Let's name this books. Okay, then we can have the value, let's say only make a book, and then coding book. Okay, so we have two groups here. Now I reload it. When we check this, we see that we have the label for this group, which is cars, and then we have the label for this group, which is, we did not say, oh no, I only added the value, but I did not add the text. Change the text here. Yeah, I need to change the text here so it doesn't repeat the same names. Okay, great. So we have this here, cars, red car, blue, and then we have the books, maker, and then the coding book as well. All right, so this is actually how we can do optional grouping in our input field, which is very, very easy to do. Good. So the next one, we want to do what we call a select box with multiple selections. So here we can have, instead of to have this drop down list, we can have a box, and then we have selections inside. Let's look at how to do that. So it's simply basically the same, and we're gonna have our option group in there and all that, but the only thing we got to change is in the selection side. Here we need to have what we call the multiple here. Multiple, then the multiple will be equal to multiple in there. Okay, so when we add this to it, let me check, we have options, groups, and all that. Okay, so this multiple should show like this, so we can scroll up and down, and then we have the same thing, and we can select from. So that is the difference between this. You just have to add the multiple in the select tag, and this is going to change to a select box with multiple options. So if we don't want the box in the selection, we just remove this, save it back, and it goes to a drop down list. Very easy to do. Okay, let me go back, and then let me refresh this. So what we want to do next is to just know how to add a text area form. You know, mostly text area form are bigger than the normal input, and it's very simple. We will still have the form, so let me just delete this. We will still have the same form tag, but we're gonna have the label for the text area, which is using the label tag. That's the label. So let's say this is address, a label for address. Okay, then we're gonna have the text area, and it's very simple. The same name applied to the tag, the text area, and this is gonna give us a really big space for us to type in. But with the text area, we can have a row, a number of row we want the text area to show, and then also we can have the column size. But This one is default, so we can type in as much as we want, and then it's gonna scroll down as much as we want. But we can still add another property, and this property is gonna actually give us some fixed row length at the beginning of the page when we load. So we can call row, and probably we want to cover 3 of the rows, and then for the column we want to cover probably 30. So I save that, and then we reload, so it becomes a little bit bigger than the first one. So that is how we control the text area for our input field in HTML. Okay, so what we have to know is that our input field can also be converted into a simple button. So for example, in the same form, we can convert our input field into a button, and input, and simply do that by using the type, and then we select button as the type, and we can add a value to it. The value will be the name. If we leave it this way, this is what we're gonna see, but the name we put in here, or the value, should expand the button a little bit. So the value, and then we have click me. That's the value. So let me reload this, and then we have click me button here. So this is converting our input field into a simple button. So what if we want to add a file select or to import file in our form? Simple. Still inside the form tag, we still have our input, and then I can add a label to this. So let me add a label first. So label, and with the label, let's say select file, just for the label. And then for the input field, instead of button, we change this to a file. Very easy. And then probably we need to have the name, so we differentiate it from other input fields. So the name, we just want to say this is an upload. And we can have an ID here, so the label can, let me close this. So this is how we create a file for it. So we can use ID for this one when we want to perform an action on. So we can simply add an ID here in the near future when we want to perform an action on it. So we can upload stuff here with an action, which can take this upload to the place we want to upload it. So this is how we create files, by just changing the type. So let's say we want to create a simple input field and submit. So it's very simple. It's the same label we have. So we can say we have a first name here, and with the first name we can have an input of text. And then you can decide to have a unique name for it, like a first name or something, and then we can decide to add ID or not. Then we can have another one, which is simply gonna be a button. So then we need to have a value for this button, so it appears on the button. So value, and then we'll say submit, and we can add any other button here. So maybe a reset or something. So let's save this, and voila, we have the first name. We can have a submit or a reset, but we have this comma here, which is not necessary. So first name, then we have a submit, and then a reset. So this is how we can use input field to create, nice, button input field actions in the future. If you have any question, you can leave it in the comment section. Thank you, and see you in the next video.